Welcome, acolytes. Good effing news, as I hear. Warhammer MMO. How does this sound? In my opinion, it sounds extremely nice. As you might or might not know, I'm a big Warhammer fan. Let's just say I am not a big fan on the story side that I read every book. I am reading them from time to time just to get it out. Especially Archon did it to me. But the thing is, I love the entire premise and the entire story. And I'm even playing the private server Warhammer Online. The Re-Reckoning, or how it's called. Irrelevant. Chopper. I just say Chopper. Let's see what the man Force Gaming has to say about this. Let's start.
Have already heard there's a new Warhammer MMO currently in development. I've been following this since it was first revealed early last year. The game is being made by HYPT, a studio founded in 2022 by Jack Emmerich, who is probably best known as the co-founder of Cryptic Studios and the lead designer on both City of Heroes and City of Villains, as well as quite a few other MMOs who he has been involved with. Well, in May of last year,
if I recall correctly,
it was revealed that the first game of his new studio, the one that they're making, is going to be a full-blown Warhammer MMORPG. In the press release announcing this title, Emmerich said, "As someone who has molded my career developing expansive MMO stories, I'm proud to unveil that our first game in development at Jackalyptic Games will focus on the rich universes of Warhammer. Bringing the deep lore of this IP to our game is a massive undertaking, and we are thrilled to work alongside Games Workshop to bring this vision to life." Now, the announcement went on to discuss that they're going to be working closely with Games Workshop, who themselves are in the midst of quite a large push to further establish Warhammer's presence in gaming. Over the past few years especially, we have seen not only quite a large number of Warhammer games, but also many fairly high quality ones as well. It appears like Games Workshop has really started to focus on making sure that they're licensing their rights to studios that they believe will make something good. And that has been paying off. I mean,
I'm gonna be honest, yes, I actually preferred the approach beforehand where they just said, okay, just try everything out. But I mean, a bit of an insurance that they make good games is actually quite good. And also, a lot of games are really good. Vermintide. Loved that. Or even Darkseid. I didn't play it that often. I have to actually do it at some point, but F me, it looks fantastic. I played it a bit, but not that.
I mean, most recently in the past 3 years, we have gotten Space Marine 2, Rogue Trader, Bolt Gun, and Darktide. Every single one of those games currently has a very positive rating on Steam. Now, probably the most divisive of that list being Darktide, which did have a rough early access launch, but has seemingly turned things around over the past 2 years, and like I said, is currently sitting at very positive. The point being, though, Games Workshop clearly appears to be licensing their IP to studios that they feel are going to do a good job, which is fantastic to see. Like, I love it. I'm all here for it. The Warhammer universe is cool as hell. It's inspired so many other franchises that I enjoy. So I am more than ready to be getting more good Warhammer games. Yes, Games Workshop has in the past played it a little fast and loose with handing out their IP to whoever, no matter the quality that the games turn out. But like I said, it has seemed like in recent years that they have been doing a better job of narrowing the focus and trying to make sure these are good games coming out, because you want to be associated with good games compared to bad ones, right? I mean, in fact, if anything, I would say my biggest gripe currently is the fact that I just wish that some of these awesome Warhammer games that we have been getting would also include some Warhammer Fantasy or Age of Sigmar settings. Like, the past few years of great Warhammer games have been almost entirely 40K, right?
Yeah, that's the thing. I would love more fantasy. I particularly love Warhammer Fantasy. I just love it. This is, as you might guess,
which I love. I've enjoyed these games. Space Marine 2 is fantastic. I like Darktide. I want to see some more Warhammer Fantasy. Personally, selfishly, that's what I'm looking for. Speaking of which, let's talk about that new Warhammer MMO in development. What do we know about it so far? Well, before we dive in, though, Quick word from today's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by King Arthur Legends Rise. This is an all-new collection RPG featuring an immersive story, turn-based combat, and exploration through a reimagined Arthurian world. You'll adventure through Camelot with an ever-growing squad of knights, mages, and rogues that you take into battle against epic bosses and mythical creatures. There are 10 open-world zones to explore where you'll complete side quests, solve puzzles, and find treasure. Battles offer a twist on traditional turn-based RPG combat with a focus on player choice. As you progress, you'll collect upgrades and equip your heroes with powerful weapons that can change their abilities. The game has a 10-chapter story campaign that features fully voiced dialogue and loads of cinematics. This was developed on Unreal Engine 5, and so in turn features great-looking 3D characters, animations, visual effects, and environments. On top of that, you can play at home or on the go thanks to seamless cross-play and cross-progression between PC and mobile platforms. So if you're interested and would like to learn more, you can check out King Arthur Legends Rise. Pre-registration is available now using the link in the description below. All right, so the new Warhammer MMO, let's talk about it. Following the game's initial reveal, Emmerich sat down for an interview with MMORPG.com, and here he provided a few small initial details on the project. When asked what it's like to be creating a game for such an iconic franchise, he said, "We haven't specified the particular IP yet, but I can tell you as a longtime fan of everything Warhammer, I am thrilled. Honestly, my career has been spent trying to create games inspired by my personal hobbies." He then listed off the numerous MMOs that he has been involved with: City of Heroes and Champions Online, from his love of comic books. He did Star Trek Online, he's a fan of D&D, and so they worked on Neverwinter, and DC Comics with DC Universe Online. They also took a couple stabs at Marvel, one of which unfortunately did get canceled in production. We never ended up getting to seeing that, but he also finally said, yes, Warhammer, that is another big passion of mine as well. Now, Emmerich was then asked if he can share anything about their vision for a Warhammer MMO and what players might expect. He said, "I really can't get into specifics, but I've tried with all of my games to be 100% authentic. Sure, we've had bugs or I've made a dumb design decision, but I've always loved the products I've made and I've played them incessantly. I like to think that the majority of fans have always understood that part of it." And you know, I would agree that not without their issues, many of the games that he's been involved with have found themselves dedicated fans.
That's correct.
The game turned out to have terrible monetization in the end, but I would be lying if I said I did not love the time that I spent playing Neverwinter. That was a very fun MMO. Really loved the world, thought it was immersive.
And by the way, I don't want to defend him, but probably the guy that actually did those things didn't really decide to make this monetization stuff. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I cannot read minds, but I mean, for now it sounds quite fine. We don't have a lot to think this.
I enjoyed the combat and the dungeons, exploring how they handled zones and the player-driven content. There was just a lot that I liked about Neverwinter, even if its cash shop ended up dragging down the whole experience in the end. I guess that's all there is to say. And maybe that's foreshadowing of what we can expect in the future, especially considering who's funding this studio, which we'll get to. Now, in another interview done with WCCF Tech, Emmerich went into a bit more detail on their early ideas and plans for the game. This included quite a few things, like their main tenets, the fact that they're focusing on staying true to the Warhammer IP and on delivering an accessible game at the same time for a wider audience. He also mentions the engine they're using, his thoughts about MMO combat, business models, so let's dive into all this stuff here. So when asked about the team of developers who were working on the game, Emmerich said that there were a lot of people who reached out after he left his prior studio, which was Daybreak Games, who wanted to continue working with him on his next project, on top of them bringing in a good mix of new talent as well, adding that one of the great things about being in Austin, which is where the studio is located, Austin, Texas, is that there are so many experienced game developers. It is a
good Austin, Texas. Thank you, for F's sake. I was a bit scared right now, Acolytes. My bones shivered right now. This just, good. Texas is right now actually a pretty big red flag. Of course, I'm a bit worried about the new talent because, I mean, the young people aren't all bad. There are a lot that are really, really good, but I really, really hope that they actually get the people that want to work, that want to actually show what they are capable of and share their love for this product. So,
talent-rich area, going on to add that there's also a lot of developers who have a ton of MMO experience as well. For example, BioWare Austin is the ones who developed Star Wars The Old Republic, and then you have anyone related with the heyday of Ultima Online, then later NCSoft, and of course more recently BioWare, and on top of things like the 101 folks over there at King's Isle. I think per square mile we have more MMO in this area than just about any other city. So yeah, a lot of experienced MMO developers working at Jackalyptic Games on this Warhammer MMO. Got it. What else? Well, as for the engine, Emmerich said, we are pretty set on Unreal Engine 5. I think the days of creating our own engine are long over. We have wonderful options out there. He also mentioned Unity, but it sounds like UE5 is what they're sticking with. Then the interviewer mentioned the fact that that engine has procedural content generation framework that could benefit their upcoming game, to which Emmerich said, yeah, we're definitely looking at all of it as an option. And of course, a lot of this procedural generation framework doesn't just mean we're dealing with fully procedural games, but that these procedural tools help developers make larger worlds with smaller teams, and that's the kind of way of leveraging technology to your favor while keeping things within budget and not making it go crazy out of control. That's the kind of stuff that we would hope for, really. He was then asked if he could clarify what Warhammer IP that they're working on, to which he said, so we haven't identified which one, but it is definitely an IP belonging to Warhammer. The interviewer's response to that was, just to be 100% clear, when you say that, you mean Warhammer Fantasy, not 40K, right? To which Emmer replied, no, it could be anything. It's not set yet. Or rather, it is set, but we're not announcing it right now. It is something within the brand of Warhammer, whether it be Fantasy Old World, Age of Sigmar, 40K, or something else. It's something within the Warhammer umbrella. As previously mentioned, and further clarified.
F me, make it the Old World, please, for all this beauty. I wouldn't even mind. Yes, I'm gonna get a bit hate of this, but I wouldn't even mind Age of Sigmar to a certain degree if they just tone down the freaking Space Marines there. But the Old World would be optimal. I love it. Oh, please, for F's sake. I already hope they make a Necromancer.
Clarified here. As of now, they are not yet revealing what kind of Warhammer game it's going to be. Now, I'd be happy with any branch of Warhammer for an MMO, whether that's fantasy or 40K. Personally, my preference leans towards fantasy, but either way, I'd be fine with any of it. I'm a little unsure as to why they're being so dodgy about this question, even to this day, over a year and a half later, post this interview. They've still not clarified which iteration of Warhammer, which Warhammer setting it's going to be in. I don't know why they feel the need to keep this hush-hush to keep it a secret.
Make a good game,
regardless,
the rest is
that's where we sit. After this, Emmerich actually went into fairly lengthy detail about some of their high-level visions for the project, that being this desire to bring Warhammer to a much wider audience. You certainly can't argue that Warhammer is a small niche thing. Talking about mass scale, wide appeal. So here he said, number one, I don't think the rich lore of Warhammer is widely known. I mean, there are fanboys like me who read the books, play the games, and so forth, but it's sort of like Marvel in the late 70s or early 80s, where you had a core audience that absolutely loved Marvel to death, but the mass market really didn't know about it, and he's not wrong. Marvel of the 70s and 80s and even the 90s is nowhere near how Marvel is in terms of wide recognition amongst the general audience that it is today. He goes on to say, and I think Warhammer finds itself in a very similar way. Now, there's going to be a series with Henry Cavill, and hopefully my game, and hopefully Space Marine 2, which is coming out soon. Remember, this is from like a year and a half ago, but as we know, Space Marine 2 came out, people absolutely friggin' loved it, and the game's doing phenomenally well. He continued, they're bringing back the Fantasy Old World miniatures game, and there are games for Warhammer Fantasy like Total War. They're bringing the message out about what the IP is, and my goal with whichever Warhammer IP.
By the way, I'm gonna interrupt here. Total War Warhammer right now is actually quite fine. Not the best game, but you won't get a better strategy game for Warhammer than Total Warhammer. It's just, except for the fucked up city freaking Belagerungsschlachten. You know what I mean if you played it. But I mean, It's good right now.
Yeah,
maybe a bit too expensive, but
on
it's
because he won't clarify, is to help teach people about it and unveiling in much the same way the MCU has done for Marvel Comics, where it's taken this vast amount of lore and distilled it and presented it so that people can slowly but surely learn about it. That's one area of focus that I've had. Another area of focus, he continues, is that he wants to make the games accessible, making sure anybody can sit down and play. That's been a consistent theme through much of my career, trying, sometimes poorly, to make sure that I'm allowing the game to be enjoyed by the greatest number of people. At the end of the day, I view any game that I make as a chance for someone to escape for an hour or 2 hours a day to dive into another world. I don't want to overwhelm anyone with game mechanics and requirements. I just want them to sit down and enjoy themselves. So I think that's another area of focus. Now, one thing...
I mean, make it a bit challenging. Don't overdo it, but also don't underdo it, you know? Don't make it too easy.
That I definitely don't want to neglect to mention here is that Jackalyptic Games is fully funded by NetEase. Now, to this point, the interviewer asked if that means we should be expecting this Warhammer MMO that they're making to be playable on mobile devices because, hey, NetEase, they make a lot of mobile games, right? Emirates said that the mobile market is not one that I know. It's very hard. It's very difficult. I am by no means an expert in it, but I will say that the great thing about working with NetEase is that they're more interested in what I want to create than in the platforms that I want to create it on. And they're good with whatever we choose, provided that it makes financial sense, of course, but there's never been any pressure or suggestion that we should have to do mobile, no top-down commandments like that. Now, while I appreciate his attempt here to make us say, guys, don't worry, NetEase isn't forcing us to make this game a mobile MMO. He also gives a little wiggle room in that statement that there's the possibility that it could be if the financials required it. But I think regardless of an MMO thing, because I don't necessarily think that this is going to be a mobile MMO. I mean, it goes one way or another. I'm just guessing, right? But even if it isn't, with NetEase's involvement, we can certainly, without question, say it's going to be monetized probably quite similarly to a lot of NetEase games. Now, these can fluctuate depending on the title. Some are more heavily monetized and predatory than others. Either way, they tend to lean into the more monetization than not category, and that may very well be the case here. It has been the case with quite a handful of Emirates prior games. As previously mentioned, Neverwinter was otherwise an MMO that I really enjoyed, had one of the craziest cash ops in an MMO that I spent any significant time playing, so something to keep in mind. The interview goes on with some other interesting stuff. He talks about basically confirming the fact that the game is going to be some action combat iteration, or rather that it's not going to be full-blown old-school tab target MMO. That's not what they're doing. He says, I'm not sure I'll ever go back to doing a more traditional MMO. Maybe one day I will, but I don't think so. After the games that I've done, from Neverwinter to DC Universe Online, and of course that canceled project, the Marvel one, I focus mainly on games with more fluid combat than what I created when I first entered the industry years ago. So again, pretty much soft confirming here that it's going to be an action combat of some sort, maybe something similar to what they did with Neverwinter, or maybe more full-blown action combat similar to New World. We'll have to see. Now, next he addressed the business model, and this was interesting. He said, several years ago, I would have thought that free-to-play was the best option. I think the success of a game like New World, however, has demonstrated that you can do straight-up buy-to-play. I do think that there's room for subscription-like systems like Fortnite has done with the Battle Pass. While I'm not sure whether a traditional monthly fee would be as successful today, but there are options available that I didn't think were possible up until New World launched.
And by the way, I would say that the best way of monetizing it, or for the customer, is a monthly payment. Because you can just stop it. Of course, if you want to try the game, that's where we get a bit of a headache here. But I would say, like, first month, just let them play for free. Okay. But monthly monetization is the best way if you're ignoring if you just won't do the shop. It's not for everyone, but it's the most fair and acceptable monetization in my opinion, just because you can keep everything on the same level no matter what. Be it from the difficulty of the game, you won't have a whale that just freaking stomps you, and even from the simple looks or attire way, because looking freaking awesome in a game is also very important. It's just the most fair way.
wasn't entirely sure that one could successfully just sell a box and really make enough revenue. Obviously, that one did quite well. Now, as a reminder, this interview was done in May 2023. This was about a year and a half after New World's original release, and at that time, the game was still averaging around 20,000 peak concurrent daily players, which was far from their record of 900,000 peak concurrent, but also a fair bit above its lowest peaks, which we saw earlier this year when the game was only getting around 3,000 concurrent. The point being, clearly, his mention of New World's success isn't referenced specifically to the huge popularity and the massive numbers of copies that they sold when the game first came out. They certainly made a lot of money right out the gate, right? But I would be curious if you were asked the same question today about the MMO business models and what they might do, if Emmerich would still say that he thinks New World proves you can have a successful MMO with just a box price. Because the current speculation is that unless New World has established a massive new player base on console with the launch of Aeternum, that there's a good chance they'll be putting the game into maintenance mode and moving all their focus on the in-development Lord of the Rings MMO. Only time will tell. This is just speculation, but with the way updates were going the year prior to Aeternum's launch, things have seemed to really slow down on the development front of continuous updates and content and features and new things. He is saying that he thinks a box price MMO after the launch of New World is something that can work. Can you sustain on that though? Has New World sustained? How is their content update frequency? You know, for as much flack as New World gets, it is true that it is probably one of the best and fairest MMO monetizations, because they don't have a crazy cash shop in there. They don't have pay to win. They don't have a required monthly subscription. They do just have a single box price, and that's pretty good compared to a lot of other MMOs. But that only single box price resulted in a game that didn't get a lot of post-launch support. So was it enough to successfully maintain an MMO? It was enough to make them some money at launch, but to keep that game going and keep it growing doesn't seem so. Regardless, Emmerich did another series of interviews some months later with Warhammer fan site Wargamer. Here's some info that we got from that. They said that they have about 45 developers working on the game. This was in mid-2023, and are hoping to keep the total team size under 100 people. Obviously, as you know, with fewer people, there's less bloat, less moving parts, and everyone has more intimate knowledge on the project, which can certainly result in a game that feels more cohesive with a single vision. There's currently no timeline on when we should expect the game, but he said that they have got a load of freedom and flexibility, both temporally as well as monetarily, to just focus on making the game the best that it can be. And finally, he said that he's really passionate about Warhammer and wants to create this living, breathing world that embodies everything that's great about it, where players can just feel like they're getting a truly immersive space in that universe to explore. Now, Emmerich also discussed a few things here that I want to talk about. First off, the desire for a good MMO that's just not being currently fulfilled. He said after World of Warcraft, people tried to copy World of Warcraft, and in doing so, they tried to compete with World of Warcraft, which meant investing a lot of money, which then required a lot of profit. It required a massive success bigger than Warcraft. And when they didn't achieve that, because of course they didn't, World of Warcraft was one of a kind. Most of the major publishers gave up on MMOs. To this day, we live in a world where in the West, there are very few MMOs. So from the perspective of the genre, I would say that there's still demand. New World came out and quadrillions of copies were sold, well above 10 million, which is amazing, which tells me there are people who want to play an MMO, but there is nobody making them. I'm happy he is at least saying it out loud, because that is he's completely spot on.
Correct,
the potential of modern tech for the genre. This is really interesting. He said, I would love to see a world where we can create a truly dynamic, interconnected setting so that you can just roll it out and players' interactions with it create random events. So for example, if there's an orc tribe in the hills and players kill a bunch of them because the farmers gave them a quest to do it, there are no more orcs. Unfortunately, the orcs were the only thing keeping the dark elves in the caverns underneath, so then all of a sudden the dark elves come out. 10 years ago, that would have been an impossible thing to create. Famously, EverQuest Next, which is the exact thing that I thought about when he mentioned this, so I'm glad he referenced it. Famously, EverQuest Next wanted to do some of this stuff, but EverQuest Next was canceled precisely because it's just impossible. But I think we can get there, and we can effectively create a true world where you have PvE entities, factions, individuals, each operating with their own goals and agendas that affect each other and the players depending on the player reaction.
This could be something very, very nice, but it also could end extremely poorly. I think this is a very big gamble he's doing there. Don't get me wrong, it sounds extremely cool, Acolytes, but in the end of the day, I can imagine that the only thing that would actually happen there would be that, well, people will grieve, so you never get to see an orc. Or something like that. So, I don't know. It sounds cool, though. It sounds really, really
And I think
cool.
there's so much potential for something like this. I mean, even just the simple example that he gives, you have NPCs in an area, you get a lot of players clearing out those NPCs, and those NPCs were battling others that kept them at bay, and then those ones creep in. I think even just the idea of this tug of war back and forth between NPCs within zones or zones that are connected to each other, pushing in and out of those regions, I think that alone, even if it doesn't get more dynamic than that, I think that alone is really interesting and would help create some diversity to the world. It's just clear to me that there's a lot of potentially exciting and interesting things that they could do here for making the worlds feel more dynamic without impeding too much on the players that come in late to the party. You know what I mean? Because that's always the idea. If you have MMOs where the game world and landscape drastically change based on player action, then that means the latecomers don't get a good experience, or it can mean that, and it has meant that in some games in the past. So you need to balance those, I think, if you're still having to have this mix of a theme parky world with sandbox or dynamic elements without it being full sandbox, so that people are just erect buildings all over the place, if you know what I'm talking about. All right, what about his thoughts on PvP focus in the genre? To this, Emirate said, I have never emphasized PvP. God bless all the games that depend on it. I don't know how to do it. If I play a PvP game and I lose several times in a row, I don't want to play anymore, right? Like, getting your head beaten isn't necessarily fun, and so you end up winnowing down your population. Clearly, games like Overwatch have figured it out, but I don't have any bursts of invention or ingenuity to figure out something new. PvP is not and will never be a focus of mine, probably for the rest of my career. Now, I do want to point out, just because he's saying PvP isn't a focus, that doesn't mean that I think there won't be PvP in this game. It's still possible. In my opinion, for an MMO to be successful, there needs to be a strong PvE focus to appeal to the larger masses and the casual players, but also some element of PvP within that, be it servers or zones where PvP is available, or optional game modes that people can do, like arenas or battlegrounds, etc., where players who like PvP can get their fill of it there. In fact, the best MMOs I have ever played and stuck with the longest have had some mixture of both.
And by the way, it's freaking Warhammer. How the frick you wanna do a freaking Warhammer MMO without any PvP? This just isn't realistic. And I think that Space Marine 2 proved it pretty hardly, because I mean, the gameplay itself, the campaign was fine, but the PvP was... oh my freaking god, this was so awesome. The PvP was so great. I'm still... the PvP was just fantastic. So, nah. I think, especially in a Warhammer game, you need that. And the other point is, now, that's a red flag for me. That's definitively a red flag for me. Not a killer, but a red flag. And now I am actually asking myself, hey, will there be a Order versus Chaos thing? So you can play both sides? Or will it be just a... well, you play the good guys. Fair enough. Because those... I just don't... I mean, I don't know a MMO that had this kind of PvP and this successful. No. Final Fantasy, it's fine. But the PvP in that also is, well, it's, in my opinion, pretty boring. Okay.
The fully dedicated PvP ones, he's right. Too much griefing, it's really hard to balance, and the idea of experienced players dominating the less experienced players, and then all of the wolves driving away the sheep, and then there just being wolves left, and there's not a lot of those wolves, and they all drive themselves off, and eventually you've got a dead game, which many PvP-focused MMOs have ended up devolving into after some amount of time. Not all of them. Some have been successful, but I think, again, the ones that are most successful are the ones that can balance it. I look at a game like Albion Online. There is a huge PvP focus in Albion Online, but you can also just chill in medium and low level areas, gathering and crafting, taking your time, and never step foot into PvP. And I would love to see the numbers on the percentage of the player base, for as popular as Albion is, that actually fit that demographic. I would guess it's actually more significant than you would expect from a game that is perceived as being PvP focused. Now, after that interview, there's been pretty much radio silence. Like, that is officially everything that we've read, seen, and heard thus far about the game. It does look like development is trucking along. A brief peek at their LinkedIn page reveals that there are currently 63 employees working at the studio, so about 20 more since that interview in mid-2023. Interestingly enough, though, this upcoming game from HYPT isn't the only new Warhammer MMO in development. That's right, there's another. So in 2021, news came out that Nexon was working on a Warhammer MMO set in the Age of Sigmar. Although you would be forgiven for thinking that this was that terrible mobile game from a couple years ago called Odyssey, it's not that. That game was made by Virtual Realms. This Nexon MMO is something entirely different. Now, it might still end up also being another bad mobile game, but as of now, we don't know for sure. Nexon has developed PC and console-focused titles, and they might very well be doing so with this one here as well. We'll have to see. I gotta say, I am just genuinely excited at the potential alone of getting a Warhammer MMO. So far, there have only ever been
Okay, good. Let's just start like this. Nexon, I don't trust them for shit, so I won't even acknowledge this one because I, of course, hope that the game will be good. I always hope for the best. But, you know, you have to see it realistically.
2 attempts with Warhammer Online, Age of Reckoning, which I think was genuinely a solid game. I had fun in the time that I played it, although, obviously, as we know, it was not commercially successful enough to stay afloat, having officially shut down in 2013, just 5 years after release. Regardless, though, the game found enough of a fan base with what was there that it's gone through a bit of revival in recent years, seeing a fairly successful private server scene that's still alive today. And then there was Dark Millennium Online. This was the 40k themed MMO that unfortunately got canceled before it even launched. A huge disappointment for me, considering how clearly far along the game was in development. The official trailer from 2010 showed what looked to be a pretty darn fleshed out game. Would have loved to see it. You know, in so many ways, Warhammer is just such a perfect franchise for the MMO genre. 40k or fantasy, both of these are great. And with the success of games like Space Marine 2, Vermintide, and Darktide, I have done so much daydreaming in recent years of getting any of these worlds expanded into a full-blown open world MMO. There's just so much for them to work with. Here is hoping that in the coming years, HYPT Games delivers on that potential. Either way, I will keep...
I also hope the same, because for F's sake, Acolytes, I would be so happy. That's why I'm playing the freaking game myself. The thing is, I am playing on the private servers, and it's totally legal, by the way. You can just get it. It isn't a problem, because they don't actually make any money out of it, and Games Workshop just tolerates it. But potentially it could get a bit of a, let's just say, maybe kerfuffle if this MMO would come out and you know, Games Workshop would do what Game Workshop does, maybe. Or they just leave it alone. But at the end of the day, hey, it is what it is, Acolytes. Good night.